All right, so far we talked about basics of some key concepts in project management. What we're going to move into next are some elements of the project lifecycle. We'll talk about project management processes and knowledge areas, and then we'll close with two particular process groups, which is initiation and planning. This is kind of a little convoluted, so try to stay focused and pay attention. So there's something we call project management process groups. It's a group of processes to help us accomplish certain things on the project. When we think about general management, like we mentioned, the four cornerstones, planning, organizing, directing, and control, there is an analogy for those four in the world of project management. So planning, we also call it planning. With organization, we don't really call it organization, but we call it more a mix of planning and execution. Directing is more executing the work of the project, and then control in the world of project management, we call it monitoring and control. They're kind of the same things, it's just worded differently. Also in project management, there are two other elements that are little additions. One is initiating, because projects have start and end dates different than just general operations. They have to have an initiation and, of course, a closure. So these are two differences. The initiation set of processes are focused particularly or related particularly to projects. You won't see that in general operations management. And then you have the closing piece, which is also specific to projects. All right. In some circles of project management and business, you will hear the word implementation. So someone would say, we started implementation. It's the same as saying we are currently executing the work of the project. Kind of the same thing. All right. So what is the process group? It's just a mix of processes. Some are tactical and some are strategic, and we'll talk about the difference between both. That can be grouped into these 5 key areas. All right. So let's think about a project life cycle. Just like anything that has a start and end, projects have a confined duration, as we discussed earlier. So usually it starts with a conceptual phase, a phase where you're pondering on the problem, you're brainstorming, you're coming up with ideas. We call that the concept phase. And then it's followed by some design phase. You're designing a solution, you're designing a product, a service, something that this project will attempt to accomplish, your final big deliverable. And then there's an implementation phase when you actually do the work, you start to see some results. And then when it's all done, you deploy your product or your service into the market for people to use. And at some point it might get disposed and you close out your project and you're done. So that's from a high level conceptual perspective, the 5 phases of a project. Now, within each of these phases or stages, some people call them stages, some people call them phases. In modern terminology, we have a concept of agile project management, which we'll talk about on the 3rd day. In this case, we call them sprints. So it could be called a phase, a sprint, or a stage. Doesn't matter. The idea here, it's a part of the life cycle of the project, somewhere between the start date and the end date. Within each of these stages, phases, or sprints, there are a series of things that happen. And we happen to lump these processes into groups. We call them initiating, planning, control, executing, and closing. That's the previous slide we just looked at. So within the concept phase, there will be an initiation process to start that phase. That process can repeat itself in the design phase as well, in some cases. It could repeat itself again in the implementation phase to kick off the implementation phase. And each of these phases could have a planning set of activities. We can do some control and so forth. In some cases, you don't have initiation for each phase or stage. You just have it at the very beginning of the project. And then each phase or stage is just to execute or implement. So things come in different, projects come in different colors and shades, as they say, but you get the general idea. Now I want to bring your attention to this dotted line here that says risk level. Remember, when you start a project, you have a lot of unknowns, right? So for example, let's take the crisis line as an example. We want to establish a crisis line that handles, let's say, 50 calls, like one of you suggested, per quarter. But we don't know what it's going to look like. We don't know, are we going to get 50 calls or more? We don't know where will we get the counselors from. We don't even know how much it would cost us to do this, right? So there's a lot of unknowns, a lot of ambiguity, a lot of lack of clarity. As you start your concept phase, you get together with your team, you spend 30 minutes, an hour, you start to formulate some ideas. You do these planning activities we were talking about. So you document a charter, you write it down, you come up with a mission, a vision, some objectives, some goals. As you do that, you become more clear on what you're trying to accomplish. So your risk level starts to drop because you become more aware of what questions you need to ask. And the level of accuracy of your cost, your estimates, increases. So at the very beginning, you don't know how much this would cost you. Would it cost $10,000 or $12,000 or $8,000? We really don't know. But as we start doing some of these planning and initiating activities, our level of accuracy of the cost and this schedule, the timeline, becomes higher and our risk level drops. By the end of the project, when the project's all done, your risk level is really almost zero because you're done with it, right? So this gives you an idea of how things change over the life cycle of a project. Here you see there's a lot of planning. This is the level of activity. A lot of planning happens on projects. If you're not spending the bulk of time on planning, you're not doing a good job. A lot of people jump right into executing work. They start to do a lot of work. So this is the planning curve here, this solid black line. You see how up front there's a lot of planning and it moves on, it starts to drop, but it's still there. And then it drops and tailors off towards the end. You want to spend as much planning as possible up front so you have a very easy, smooth ride when it comes to executing the work, which is this dotted line here with big circles. As you see, go ahead.
Sorry. I do this all the time. So I feel like when you're doing planning, yeah, you should put enough effort into like actually planning because I feel like if you're trying to create like a really good movie or video game or TV show or whatever, I feel like you need to like at least put in at least a year's worth of really good planning because yeah, like you said, apparently a lot of people kind of just they don't put enough time into actually planning this. You just kind of like wing it and then just go right to like the final stage disposal, as in like just putting it out there and hoping that it will actually work, which really no needs to like
And
have an
the
plan.
cost of rework usually grows by a factor of 10 between each of these phases. So if something is going to cost you on the project $1, and you know that today because you've accounted for it and you planned it, it would cost you $10 when it comes to design if you missed it here. If you figure it out later in the design phase, it would cost you $10. If you missed it in both and you figure it out during implementation as you're doing the work, it costs you $100. And if you figure it out as you're deploying the system, already people are using it, it's a magnitude of 1,000. That's how costly things are. And that's why some projects take a really dive down and they just go out of control because they miss some major requirement, major need during this concept and design phase. So you're absolutely right. A lot of work and emphasis has to be put up front during planning. It's not wasted time. It pays off later on the whole lifetime of the project. Some people are impatient or organizations want to cut corners and save money. So they just kind of, like you said, wing it and hope that it works out. Obviously the level of planning that needs to go in needs to be proportional to the cost of the project and the level of risk. If it's a low cost project, it doesn't make sense to spend too much time on the planning. I mean, it still has to be the same percentage. So usually the rule of thumb, you might want to take note of this, is 40% of the work on a project is planning work. 40%. So if you're spending 10 hours on a project, you should spend 4 hours planning it right, and then 6 hours making it happen. You know, maybe 4 hours making it happen and 2 hours closing it up, testing, controlling, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I feel like that's the thing, you know. Yeah, like basically put enough like effort into this because again, I keep like going back to the whole writing, like the whole like TV show movie type example because I'm kind of like interested in that kind of stuff, trying to like make like really good stories and turn them into like really good shows, right? You know, I feel like when we're talking about like video games, there's a lot of effort in making it look good, which I appreciate. Like,
All right,
like,
let's talk about specific examples. This will be during the coaching period, so we can dive deeper into particular areas and projects like the one you're explaining, and apply what we're learning. But let's try to stay on topic just so we don't run out of time. But I appreciate the thought. All right, one question here, a quiz for you guys, and you can put the response in the chat box. As you notice here, the level of risk drops, right? This dotted line, but then it goes back up here during the deployment period, and then it sharply drops off again. Why do you think there's this little bump here? Any thoughts?
for like risk.
And this is for the whole group. You can put it in the chat just so everyone gets a chance to share their thoughts. So why does the curve come back up? The level of risk increases as you deploy your project and give it to your users to do something with it. Unknowns in deployment, exactly. So when you've built your project and you've done design and all that good stuff, you had certain assumptions about what's out there, right? We don't know all the time everything that's out there that's working. So, if we take the example of the crisis line, we build it, we launch it, and then we start to hope people call. People do call, but then we find there's a problem. The way they're calling is not what we expected, or the nature of the calls are more in one area than what we thought, and the counselors we have are not trained in that area, for example. So there could be some unknowns in the outside of your project, in the environment around it. And that's why you can see that hump. And as you learn, it starts to drop. And then by the time you close your project, it goes away. So in the case of the crisis line, folks might not show up. Maybe you thought you would market it in a certain way. So you could have built a very good crisis line, but no one is calling because your marketing is not what you expect it to be. All right. So this chart hopefully explains these key concepts. So again, to review, we have a project, start and end date, which starts here, it ends here. In between, there's some stages or phases or sprints. And within each, we have a set of processes, a set of activities that we have to do that relate to initiating the project or the sprint or the stage, planning it, controlling it, managing the work, doing the work, and closing it off. And these are milestones here. In this particular example, we're using the project of finding a job. So someone is trying to find a job, and we're applying the concepts of project management to that particular mission or objective. And they're starting with a charter for themselves, like, I want to find a job in 90 days with this specs in this metro area. They're putting a scope statement, they do some plans, they write a resume, that's a deliverable, they start applying, they get offers, and then they close their project and learn some lessons that would help them in future job hunting activities. So you can apply this in pretty much anything in your life, and of course on work projects. Any questions? All right, so besides project process groups, there's also what we call knowledge areas. Knowledge areas are subject matter specific domain areas. For example, scope management. What is scope and how to manage scope and how to validate scope and how to verify it? That's one example. Another example is schedule management. So controlling your time on the project, your deadlines, making sure your resources are available in the right times, things like that, scheduling your activities one after the other, making sure you understand which activities depend on other ones, cost management, coming up with a budget, an estimate, financial forecasts. How much would this project cost me? What's the best case scenario cost and the worst case scenario cost? And we'll talk more about these things, tomorrow in more detail. Another domain is quality management. How do I ensure the quality of the deliverables that are being achieved on this project? Resource management, your staffing, bringing in the right people at the right time. You don't want to bring people on your project too early, then you're paying them and they're not working. You don't want to bring them too late. They delay your project because they have to ramp up and take some time to know what's going on. So that's another area where it's kind of very closely related to schedule management and cost management as well. Communications, how are you going to communicate things to people on your team? What kind of tools would you use? When do you use these tools? When do you use email versus something like a Slack or a WhatsApp or other means of communication? Are we going to capture notes in a certain format? Where do we keep them? How do people find them? All those kinds of things usually go into your communications plan. So remember that the word management is those four cornerstones: planning, organizing, directing, and controlling. So each one of these things you see on the screen is going to include all four components, in that process group. Another example is integration. You might be building the example that was shared earlier about the making, films or movies, documentaries, or stories. You're integrating different pieces of content, different technologies to achieve your end result. In the case of the crisis line, you're integrating, again, technology with human resources, these counselors, with some processes, how to actually capture a call. How do you bring that all together to make it happen? And then risk. How do you manage risk? How do you categorize it and prioritize it and mitigate it to make sure nothing slips between the cracks? And then lastly, you might need to purchase things for your project. So there's some element of procurement. So these are some of the areas that we refer to them as knowledge areas, all right? With really, really big projects, you might have multiple project managers on that one project where each of them is responsible just for one of these items, just scope. Someone is just, their whole responsibility is make sure the project doesn't go out of scope. Someone else, their role is just to hire people, bring them on the project, get them, situated and familiar with what's going on. On smaller projects, it's usually one person who would manage the whole, area of knowledge. All right, any questions before we move on to the next activity here? All right. So there is a reference. We mentioned PMI, Project Management Institute, that organization that has kind of set the standard for project management. It's actually an ANSI standard, which is American National Standards Institute. That's an organization that categorizes all standards in the country, whether they be mechanical standards, electrical, project management, healthcare. It's just basically a long list of, it's an inventory of standards. So one of them is called the PIM book, Project Management Book of Knowledge. And they've summarized these process groups that we talked about: the initiation, planning, executing, monitoring, closing, as well as the knowledge areas. And this matrix shows the processes that exist in each one. So as you can tell, there are about 40 or so of them. And a well-rounded project management manager knows all of these things. The important thing here, a good project manager is someone who uses common sense, who knows how to deal with moving things and thinking outside the box, right? So like I shared earlier in this lower chart here on the left, you might decide to kick off your project and break it down into 3 stages. Someone else might decide to do it in 5 stages. Someone might decide to do it in 20 sprints. It doesn't matter, right? What matters is, are you experienced and a good thinker to figure out what works best for the nature of your project, right? There's not a book that's going to tell you this is how you do it. There's a book that tells you how to do it generally speaking, at a generic level, but every project is different. The same project might even be different in different organizations or within different groups in the same organization. We used to roll out technology upgrades across huge organizations that have 40, 50 departments, and we would do it very differently, department 1 through 10 through 20 through 40, because they're structured differently, their operations are different, they have different dependencies, risks, and so forth. So what's really important is you understand the concepts, and then you figure out how to apply these concepts in different types of contexts. And a good project manager, like I said earlier, is someone who can manage any project regardless what it is. Technically speaking, any one of you can go manage anyone's else project without knowing anything about their industry. So if someone is focused on mental health, you don't have to be, you know, a mental health expert to manage a project in, let's say, the food industry, or, you know, in developing movies or anything else. All right. And just these things repeat throughout the project to address different stages of the project. So we call this an interlock between your process groups and your knowledge areas. It's just here for reference. When you guys get the deck, you know, you can refer to it. We're not going to go in this training through every single one of these. That's a little more advanced, but we will cover, I'd say, probably 80% of it. By the conclusion of these 3 days, you would know 80% of these things, and you would have a reasonable amount of knowledge to go into any area, any business organization, and talk, you know, with experienced people who know this kind of stuff. All right, so if we were to add all three things together, that previous chart kind of showed us the matrix there on the right, the process groups, which are these 5, and then the knowledge areas here, which went across. And this is just showing you that you can have stages. It's kind of the 2 previous charts just put into one. All right. Okay, so let's talk about what we learned. So if you can share one thing you learned as far as project management knowledge areas, share that with the group in the chat. So one thing you learned from, you know, this little discussion we just had, either the process groups or the knowledge areas. (40-60) split. Yep. So you want to spend 40% of your time planning it right, so the rest is an easy ride. Great. Thank you for sharing that. What else did we learn? General versus project management. Can you clarify a little bit?
Like, I think we talked about how, like, earlier we talked about general management was like planning, organization, directing, and control, but then like how project management is a little different, where we have a few more different things to, you know, look at.
Got it. Correct. Okay. So general management. Yep. Okay.
Wait, you like, oh, sorry. Can you please repeat that, Zafir?
Oh, so I was just saying that, you know, in general management, we talked about planning, organization, directing, and control. But in project management, there are a few more other things that we need to consider. Yeah.
So yeah, general is more like overall. Project management is a bit more specific. That's why we end up talking about my stuff like like the concept phase, initiating and planning and stuff like that, and like design as well. I mean, is control and executing like that's part of like design? Is that part of the design phase?
So what are the 2 differences between the project management and general management?
I mean, general management is like overall. Project management is like specific to like the project itself.
Right, but there are two process groups that are unique to project management. What are those? Anyone remember?
Planning and execution, and then I guess like monitoring and control.
Well, those are common across both. But what's unique to project management?
Oh, sorry. It's initiation and execution, I think.
Initiation and closing.
Oh yeah, because like yeah, at end it's like the end, and there's a beginning and an end in a project. That's what makes it different from like from like operations.
That's correct. A common mistake that a lot of people do, really experienced project managers, they don't close the project. You know, they just deliver the stuff and everyone assumes that it's done, and they never sit down with their client and actually sign off and close it. And what happens is the project remains open. It just is lingering out there, draining cost and resources sometimes. Or if it's not draining any resources, it's just giving your client the impression that your work never completed. So this one process, although it's just one here in this column at the upper right, it says close project or phase. It's so important from a client satisfaction perspective, a stakeholder perspective, right? And if you're a business that wants to do repeat business with your client, it's really important that, as we say, you tie the bow. All right, great. Anything else? Maintaining cost. Yep. So great point there. We talked about project cost management, and there's 4 processes here. Cost control under monitoring and controlling, and there's planning processes. There's 3 of them. Putting a plan together for how to manage your cost, how to estimate your costs, and then doing actually the budget and determining the budget. So PMI considers these 3 planning activities in this one to be a control. And the way you do control is you measure your actual cost and compare it to your budget. And the plan here, 7.1, explains to you how to do a budget, how to classify certain expenses and things like that. We'll talk more about cost management as well tomorrow, but this just gives you a high-level map of how the whole landscape looks like. All right, thanks for sharing that. What other things did we learn? Anything else comes to mind? All right, so the key thing here, the key takeaway is that if I'm completely lost, right? Someone comes to you today, says, hey, Alawi, I need you to manage a problem facing turtles in Brazil. Can you put a plan together for that? Are you able to answer with yes or no? Not knowing anything about turtles or Brazil or whatever is happening to these turtles.
I think the goal is to say yes, right?
Right. If you have this map close to you, you can literally follow it, this kind of approach, and get to the end result, just like someone who's experienced in turtles and whatever's going on with them, and also knows project management, right? So the first thing you would do is develop a project charter. You'd say, okay, tell me, what am I authorized to do? Oh, okay, I'll give you $50,000 and 10 weeks. The next thing is, okay, let me develop a scope, a plan to manage my scope. What's the scope? Is this a research project, or we're actually trying to save a certain number of turtles, right? If the answer is, oh, this is just a research project to figure out what the problem is. Okay, so let me start to define the scope and create some work items, and we'll talk more about these things in depth. But the point I'm trying to make here is that understanding good project management gives you the ability to deal with problem solving, gives you the ability to deal with ambiguous requirements or acts, gives you the ability to handle things that are completely unknown by following a very structured approach to dissect things that are not clear into more clarity or more clear details. And we'll practice some of this, later tomorrow and the third day. All right, before we move on, any other questions?
So scope is basically what we're trying to do in regards to like the, planning process group. Yeah, and we have to like knowing what do we want to do, all that. And when it comes to like coming up with like the cost, how much money this is gonna take, there's a plan cost management, and then which kind of talks about like comparing how much money we have, our budget compared to how much money we need to spend. And right.
Yep. So we'll dive deeper into some of these processes, but you kind of gave a pretty good high level summary. So great way to wrap this slide. All right, let's move on. I think we have a little activity here to do. Okay, one more thing to talk about. So project management obviously doesn't work in a vacuum. There are other supporting disciplines. Remember, project management usually has to do with something that's new or a first of a kind. So there's going to be a product manager involved. Product management is the group that defines the features of the end deliverable, whereas the project team are responsible for making that deliverable happen. They don't necessarily have the subject matter expertise of the thing we're building. So you can have a project management team or project manager who's managing the next model of a car, but they're not a mechanical engineer, they're not an electrical engineer, they don't know anything about cars. The team that knows about cars is the product management team, the product group, and they work together to communicate some information back and forth. But the product management group would be the ones responsible for defining the specs, whereas the project management group is responsible for making sure these specs are delivered on time. There's an overlap, a systems architecture team who thinks broadly across both groups to kind of figure out how we're going to structure things, how we're going to bring everything together. Remember, architecture means components and how these components are connected. And then services management is basically a service component. For example, IT services, help desk services, payroll, accounting, those types of things that are operational, they repeat. Your project management team would need some support from that group, marketing, training, those kinds of things. And then lastly, there's acquisition management, where you can purchase supplies and get resources for your project through. So you got to work with these different types of other managers in the organization, or roles, if you will, to get your project done. All right. Questions on that?
So product management is like, that talks about like planning the product itself. Project management is the project, managing the project. Systems, architecture, and engineering. Yeah, I mean, we kind of talked about architecture here, which is supposed to be like the stuff that like goes into the project itself, such as like employees, technology, all that. What exactly is acquisition management, though?
Acquisition management is the group that helps you acquire resources for your project. So it could be your HR group if you need human resources. It could be your procurement office if you need supplies and material and things of that nature.
Basically getting stuff that we need.
Correct. From outside your organization. Right.
So like from like, say, investors, if you're trying to like get people to invest, or maybe going to other companies and buying like some of their tech that's needed for the project.
Yeah, definitely technology. Like if you're doing a partnership, that could be part of that group. Investments sometimes, depending on the nature of the project, that could be part of their function, or you could have another group, the finance group. In this case, it would fall under services management if you are trying to acquire capital. So it depends on the nature of the project and how the organization is set up. But yeah, it could also fit there as well. Good question. All right, let's move on. Okay, so recap. Let's do a little Kahoot here. Recap on some of these concept. So let me bring this up. This is module 2, I think. Yep. All right, so the code is here on the screen. I'll put it also in the chat. Same link, of course. All right, I see we got 3 people so far. All right, everyone ready? All right, let's go ahead. This is short, only 3 questions. They're related to process groups and knowledge areas, so. All right, most of us got it right. Quality control. So quality control, as we said, it's more of a control process, right? Monitoring and control. Estimating costs is a budgeting activity. It's planning. Planning, communications, and planning scope. From the name, you can tell it's a planning activity. All right, good try. Next one. Yep, it's validate scope. So remember, control is about comparing actuals to planned, right? Your actual cost to your planned, your actual expenses to your planned cost, or your actual progress to your planned accomplishments or deliverables. So validating the scope is an activity of control. The project charter is not, that's a planning activity. Training the team is an execution. It's part of your activities on the project, so it's not a control process. Directing and managing your project team is direction. It's not control. You're giving them direction. You're aligning them to the vision of the project, the next steps, you know, the priorities, that kind of stuff. All right, good try here. It's a little bit of a change in ranking. Everyone is doing awesome. All right. All right, yep, creating new user accounts. So you get new people on your team, you need to create accounts for them or give them access to documents on the project. That is an operational activity. Your service team or your IT support team can do that for you. Developing a charter is a planning activity, even though it's for an operating group, which is in this case the help desk. Planning the scope of an IT system upgrade is a planning activity, so it's not going to be done by your system or service management team. And validating deliverables for the project, that is a control activity on your project, right? That's part of your control process group. So the correct answer you would be to create new accounts. All right, any questions on these three ideas or just in general process groups and knowledge areas? Got some interesting names there.
All right, so process groups are basically like the phases that go into like, the project. Um,
So process groups are, think of them, see this chart at the bottom here? They're groups of activities that get conducted in every stage of your project, right? If you're starting off your project, and by the way, some could be optional. You don't have to do everything in every stage. So if you're starting off your project completely new, you're going to need a charter, right? Which is this one here, initiating phase. And you will do that in the concept phase. It's unlikely that you would do another charter for these other phases. However, if you are implementing a project where you deliver the entire product at the end of the first stage, whatever you call that stage, let's say department A is being upgraded, you're upgrading their Windows to Windows 10. You could do another charter for department B because department B might be different than department A. Even though this is all part of a big project, they're just sprints, you can have another charter for that second sprint and third sprint in some cases. But usually if you have a project that has concept design implementation, like what we're seeing on the screen, you're just going to have one charter. All right, so process groups are, think of them as activities that you need to do for the stage that you're in.
Could you go over validating scope?
Validating scope. So validation in general is a control activity. As you will see here in this column, the second one from the right, there's some like validate scope here. You might have another validation process, but yeah. So what you're doing here, you're consistently measuring or tracking what the team is working on compared to your scope definition, compared to 5.3. So you might start off your project saying, we want a crisis line that can address 50 calls a quarter that specializes in homelessness, poverty, domestic abuse. And your team starts to work on stuff. And they come back to you and say, hey, we found a place and we got partitions and we're setting it up and we got 2 bids from 2 different phone companies for the phone service. And then 3-4 weeks later, they come back to you and say, we also are in the process of hiring counselors. We got a poverty or a low income counselor, a social service counselor. We got a domestic abuse counselor, and we got a drug addiction counselor, right? But that's not your scope. Your scope was low income, domestic abuse, and homelessness. So what happened here is the team deviated from the scope without noticing, that happens a lot. So validating scope is basically a periodic checkpoint. Usually the project manager is the one who does it, maybe with a couple of people on the team, what we call the technical lead. The technical lead is the subject matter expert. So for the example we gave about the turtles in Brazil, the technical lead would be someone who knows about turtles, a biologist, and knows about what's going on in that part of the world, right? And that person will be working closely with the project manager to assess the scope. Because remember, the project manager doesn't have to be an expert in the technical scope of the work. They need to be an expert in managing work, but not in the work itself. So if you're a project manager for the crisis line, you might not know how close or far is substance abuse from homelessness. Like you might just not know if there's even a correlation. Sometimes there is, but sometimes there isn't. So you're going to need to lean on your technical lead to answer that question for you. But you would lead that activity of validating the scope. So maybe once a week you sit down and review what people have been working on, and you compare it to your scope definition, your document, and then you have a few questions. You go to your technical lead and say, hey, how's this related to that? He says, well, there's some relationship. So are they really close or they're kind of different things? Oh, no, they're different things. Oh, so it looks like the team deviated a bit. Yeah, I think so, right? So that's kind of how you do the scope validation.
You know, on talking about like the deviating, if if the team ends up deviating from like the original mission, the but the things they came up with could actually help, maybe we could, you know, maybe change it, you know, like modularity is very important, you know, being like flexible when necessary.
Yep, that's an excellent thought. That's a great thought because in reality, many projects don't deliver exactly what they intended. They deliver something close or less than what was intended. And you're absolutely right. Rather than make the project in the red, meaning make it a failed project, you can gracefully close it where you have retained some good utility from the work that has been done. And you're absolutely right. If you build your project in a modular way, you can even disperse some of that utility throughout the life cycle of the project so people start to benefit from some of these deliverables as you continue your work. Great thought. All right, anything else anyone wants to share? All right, awesome. So let's move on here. I think next thing we have some key project concepts. This is really simple and straightforward. So I think most of us already, we discussed that most of it already. But the difference between project scope and product scope. So let's see, let's share on the chat. What is the key difference here between the two? Or if you were to define one or the other, what would the difference be? What does the project scope focus on?
What the project like is trying to do.
Okay, can you elaborate a little bit more?
Yeah, so like it's basically the mission of what they're trying. It's basically the project's mission and objectives and goals. The product is supposed to be whatever the solution or product is supposed to be doing. So like if we're trying to create like a vaccine, the vaccine scope is to, well, actually be effective.
Right, okay, great. So in other words, we can say that the product scope are the features and capabilities of our deliverable, right? Just like you said, the vaccine needs to be effective, meaning the features of the vaccine. It works for population under 60 or population between 60 and 80, or it's effective after 3 days of administration, or whatever the features are for a vaccine, and so on. So a product scope is the set of features and capabilities of the deliverable, whereas the project scope is the work and the management that needs to happen to make that deliverable real, right? Which means, in other words, your cost, your timeline, and the quality of the work that you are expecting to see, or the grade of that work. Okay. The project scope usually gets defined by the project manager, where the product scope is defined by the product manager. And the two need to sit down throughout the project and communicate, clear enough so that they're both on the same, wavelength. Because at some point, the product manager could come back and say, you know what, let's take feature number 7 out because it seems it's going to delay things. It's too complicated and the return on investment is not that big. So the project manager go back and do a scope change and maybe reduce the budget or shorten the cycle of the project, make it shorter. There could be some impact to the project scope as well, and vice versa. If the project gets delayed, it's affecting the scope of the project, the deadlines are changing, the product now might need to change. If the product is coming out late to the market, it's no longer competitive, you might need to add more features to it. So the two kind of go hand in hand quite a bit. All right, so who focuses on financial project scope? Who would be that person, the product manager or the project manager?
Project financial scope. That would be,
Product manager?
Product management, okay. Other thoughts? Any other thoughts on who's responsible for this? So it's really a joint responsibility, right? The product manager is responsible for the profit and loss of the product that will be launched into the market. The project manager is responsible for the budget of the project that would make us realize a product that we can launch in the market. They have to work together as well on this. During the build of the product, as we're building it, it's primarily the responsibility of the project manager to make sure we're still within the budget, we're not overspending, and we're using our dollars effectively. However, that project manager needs to communicate back to the product manager how things are going, because the product manager at the end of the day is responsible for the profitability of the overall product after it's launched and deployed, right? So for example, let's say the project became so expensive. The project manager, is identifying risks and the team is working on it, and he's communicating back to the product manager saying, you know what, our project's no longer going to be $100, it's going to be $300. His role stops there. He communicated, he or she mentioned that what the cost is about and the overrun, but the product manager is the one who needs to make a call. Should we continue this project or not? Maybe we can catch up on our expenses after we deploy the product in the market and people start buying it. Maybe we can't. And we're going to lose not only during the project, but also after deployment. So it's really the product manager at that point who will make the call, right? So it could be a joint responsibility. But during the project itself, it's the main focus is on the project manager. All right, any questions on this before we move on? All right, so let's talk about another thing. So we talked right now so far on scope, about scope. We're going to talk about work items. I know some of you might find this familiar. We just talked about it a few weeks ago. You start with a to-do list, right? You're getting a request to build something. You don't necessarily know how to build it, but you just know that a number of things need to happen. So you put a to-do list that's usually random. Then you start to group them and categorize them and turn them into activities by adding a time element, by adding a start and end date for each to-do item. Once you assign a start and end date to a to-do item, we call them work items. They no longer become work items, they become activities. And not just time, but you also want to attribute dependencies. What is this activity dependent on? It could be dependent on another activity, or it could be dependent on some resource, a machine that needs to be available for this thing to happen. When you do these activities, you get results. These results lead to outcomes, and the outcomes would lead to some impact. As we mentioned earlier, with goals, your goals need to be SMART, meaning they're specific. They're very confined to a particular area of work. So for example, if we take the crisis line, we said the function of the crisis line could be domestic abuse, homelessness, and financial support. 3 areas. It's specific, but it's not measurable. We can't measure those. So then we say, of a load 30%. So 30% of the calls would be of this nature, 30% this nature, 30%. Or we have 12 counselors doing financial aid and 2 counselors doing maybe domestic abuse. So now you're starting to measure things. And it's attainable. It's something that you can achieve. It's not some imaginary dream. It's relevant. These goals are relevant to the mission of the crisis line. You're not coming up with goals that have nothing to do with it. And then you have a time-bound, a deadline for achieving those goals. So that's a SMART goal. Similarly, your impact of your project or the work that you're doing should be SMART. It should be specific, it should be measurable, and something that you can also relate to as part of your mission. So you always want to be thinking strategically at the beginning of your project when you define what work items are needed, and towards the end when you look at the outcomes and you think about, okay, did it really accomplish what it wanted? In the middle, when you're working on activities, you're more tactical. And we'll talk about strategic thinking versus tactical thinking in a little bit. But for now, I just want you to grasp two things. The concept of a work item, which is basically an item in a to-do list, just a random thing that you identified, and the concept of an activity, which is a work item plus some time element associated with it. All right. Any questions on work items or activities?
Okay. So talking about this, activities are basically stuff that you have to do. It involves like putting time into it. Work items are basically just things that you do that you can like check off.
That's correct, right. All right, let's move on. So activities, like we said, it's related to being active, which means work per unit time. If you're not active, it's not an activity, it's just a to-do item. Right, so if you can't measure it per unit time, it's just, you know, something that's jotted down. It has to have a valuable purpose. Sometimes we do activities that have very little value or no value at all. You want to be cognizant of those and try to minimize them as much as possible. It has a result, and that result should be measurable so you can tell if your activity was successful or not. They come in different types. So some are strategic activities, some are tactical, some are operational, some are clerical. And we'll talk about the differences of these when it comes to planning. But clerical is something that follows a very set standard set of procedures. Operational is the same thing. Only difference here, it's more diverse, more end-to-end. It includes different domains of work. Tactical is, you know, a problem, you just need to define which resources to apply to that problem. And strategic is you don't even know the problem, so you need to think a little bit strategy, higher level, cross-functional, and we'll talk more about these. Some activities could be core, some could be supplemental. So for example, if you take the example of a hospital, core activity is to treat people. So emergency room, patient rooms, operating rooms, you know, those kinds of things. Storage of medication. But food services is kind of supplemental. Like the hospital can outsource that to a food catering company who can come in and manage their cafeteria for them, for example, right? Or provide meals for the patients. For a school, core activities teaching, but doing payroll is something that's supplemental. They can hire a company to outsource, you know, that type of activity. Some activities are mandatory, others are optional. Example of a mandatory activity is safety checks for an aircraft before it takes off. Another, you know, an optional activity could be vacuuming the aircraft, you know, alley or hallway or aisle, as they call it, right? So the aircraft could be completely safe and it could take off and land with no problem if we did not clean the floor. So it's optional, but you can't have the aircraft take off if you do not check certain things on the fuel, for example. Some are routine. They happen the exact same way every single day. Others change. They're dynamic. They might not happen under certain conditions. And the risk goes on. Some activities are risky. We don't know how the outcome is going to look like. Some are very well understood because we've done them many times. Some are complex, which means we can't understand the outcome of this activity unless we understand all components that comprise this activity, versus a simple activity, which is, you know, just one thing, one task you're doing and you're done. And the list goes on and on. It's important as you're managing a project to be cognizant which type is, you know, this activity, so you can give it the appropriate attention. If something is mandatory by regulation, by federal guidelines, by the law, you need to be aware of that in your project. If something is routine, you know, you shouldn't worry too much about it. But if something changes, you need to know what are the circumstances that could cause it to change, because you don't want it to change on you without, you know, recognizing that. So that's a good checklist to keep handy as you have a project list of activities to ask yourself, you know, where could I have some trouble with my project? So that's activities. Next thing to talk about is milestones. So I want to pause here, give you a second or two to think about what is a milestone. It's a significant what in a project, usually a measure what. You can put it in the chat, your thoughts. So it's a significant what? Accomplishment, okay. That works. Any other thoughts? It's also a significant event, right? So it's a significant accomplishment or event in a project. Usually I measure what? It's usually a major deliverable, all right? So remember, milestones have to do with your customer, not with you. A lot of people mistake milestones for dates. Like they say, you know, we have a milestone at the end of the quarter for our project. Not necessarily. It's when you accomplish something on your project related to a deliverable that concerns or of interest to your customer, not to you or your team, but to your customer. All right. So significant accomplishment, usually a major deliverable. Let's take an example of a school field trip. What could be a milestone if we're planning a school trip, say for 200 kids to go to see, you know, an exhibit or a show somewhere? What could be a milestone for that project? Any thoughts? Choosing the location could possibly be one. What else? Collecting 100 permission slips, that could be another one. Getting on the buses. Getting on the buses itself, maybe, but you know, getting the contract from the bus company is a bigger milestone, right? But getting on the bus itself could just be an activity. Having 50 students registered. So maybe your goal is 100 and you've got 50% of your people. All right, good. Number of locations visited per day, possibly. That's more of a KPI, key performance indicator. How many places can you visit on that trip? Maybe it's more of how well are you doing as a project. All right, so I think you guys got the idea. You know, we don't need to do these other two, but milestones and members, they're major accomplishments, and they're usually tied with a payment. You get a reward as a project manager. So in the examples you gave, the 50 students registration, that's a good milestone because at that point, your client can pay you for the work that you've done up to that point. Or getting your bus contract signed, you can now be deserving to get paid because you accomplished a major milestone at that point. So kind of like it's a point in the project where a good level of value has been achieved that hypothetically speaking, if you sell this project to someone else, they can start from that point and they have some inherent value in that work that's been done. All right, scheduling. So what would scheduling be? It's a planned what for performing what and the planned dates for meeting what. So remember what we talked about, work plus time equals an activity. And what's a schedule? It's a bunch of what? Activities. So deadlines, it's planned what? Deadlines are where? So for meeting deadlines, that's correct. But it's planned what for performing what? It's planned activities for performing work and planned dates for meeting deadlines. All right, so that's basically what a schedule is. It's basically work that you took, you turned it into a list of activities to achieve that work, meeting your deadline. All right, it requires inputs. and it requires tools and outputs. Your inputs are going to be your objectives, your goals, your activity, your work items, your activities. The tools would be calendars, dependencies, dependency lists, assumptions, right? And your outputs is going to be what? A schedule. All right. Cost. Let's talk about cost for a minute. So cost is what? It is something, value of a project that includes cost for something to perform and complete the activity, as well as materials and supplies, and is usually broken down into something costs and something costs. Any thoughts? So what is cost? What kind of value is cost? Monetary value, exactly. It's the monetary or financial value of a project what?
Projects.
Why is the project existing? To accomplish something, right? For the project deliverables. So if you accomplish something on your project, you spent time and effort on it, it has a value, and that value is the cost that you've expended up to that point. And includes costs for work to perform and complete the activity, right? As well as materials and supplies. And we can break it down into two types of costs. Personnel or non-personnel. Yeah, it's a little, you can consider that one option, but it's more direct and indirect. So personnel could be your indirect costs, and then non-personnel could be direct costs of the project, any materials or supplies that you're purchasing. All right. So again, it's the financial value or monetary value of your project deliverable, and includes the cost for work. And we break it down into direct and non-direct. Direct is things the project buys directly. Non-direct costs are things that are shared across all projects in the organization, like rent, insurance, utility bills, payroll for employees that are working on these projects, things like that. All right. Direct and indirect costs are very important on government projects, government contracts. They really spend a lot of time looking into those, and there's certain thresholds that you cannot exceed in each category. They have their own accounting rules for those. All right. Go ahead.
Wait. So, okay, so cost. Like, can you go back to the previous slide, please? So cost is supposed. Okay, so the cost is supposed to be talking about, like, obviously it's supposed to be talking about how much money there is specifically for the project deliverables, which is like the end results. It includes like how much money it is to like perform and complete the activity, as well as the things we need in order to do that. And what is it? What are the costs broken down to? Like,
So there are two types of costs on a project. There are direct costs that have to do only with the project. No one else will incur those except for the project. And there are other, what we call indirect costs. These are costs that are usually shared. So if you have, if your project team is sitting in an office building, it's already paid for by the company, right? It's not necessarily just for your project, but it's a cost that the business has to incur because of the project. So it gets shared across the project and other functions in the organization, other projects. So there's direct costs, which is directly to your project, like your materials, your supplies, things that you need to purchase, and then indirect costs that are shared across the entire organization.
yeah, sorry.
All right. Other questions from anyone?
Stuff that we need to like buy.
Yep. Okay. So let's move on. Critical success factors. So really project managers' focus is on three things. One, that we have met our schedule, we meet our deadlines. Two is that we stay within budget. And three, that we deliver capabilities at the end of the day. We deliver the features and the capabilities that the project, the deliverables. So your focus is on work. Throughout the project, you want to be paying attention to how much work is being done on your project. If you're not muted, You can go on mute, just there's some background noise. All right, so good project manager is someone who's very focused on work and what's being accomplished and where does that work sit as far as our plans. All right, so let's do a quick review here. This is a group activity. Project management is about A, B, or C. You can put in the chat the number or letter that you feel is right.
Oh, can you go to the previous slide, please?
Sure. Any questions? Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, so it's about B, right? Tracking the work completed. Yes, you're gonna have to do plans, you're gonna have to document things, you're gonna have to look for low cost resources and things like that, but your main function is to track work. All right, let's do this quick exercise here. Another 3 questions on this Kahoot. I'll bring it up and get you the code. Let's go back. All right, so it is 4091384. All right, everyone ready? Let's go. Yep, work items are defined before activities. So all other 3 are incorrect. Okay, obviously outcomes are more important than results. You might get a result that's, not what you expected, but the outcome is actually much better. No one really would come back and say, why did you not achieve the results? We don't care. We got the outcomes we expected. All right, true or false? All right, why is this false? What's missing here? Remember, what is a SMART goal?
No,
What does the S stand for?
specific.
Right, so the clinic here is not specific enough. It doesn't specify what types of patients or specialties, right? It does measure this 50 patients and it has a time bound, the month. So the T exists, the M exists, it's probably attainable and it's relevant, we'll assume it's relevant. What's missing is this specificity, right? It should have said something like built a clinic to treat 50 whatever specialty patients or number of specialties, right? So it's an example of a subtle thing that people miss quite often. You find on so many projects, goals are not even close to being SMART at all. You want to really refine your goals to make sure they're SMART, because that would help ensure that you achieve what you're trying to get at the end of the day. All right, next one. Yep, completing the foundation, because we said that milestones relate to our end users, our stakeholders, and they're part of the utility of, the outcome of this project. So that's the correct answer. The other ones are things you probably need to do as well, but they're not key milestones. All right, let's see what it's looking like. Okay, good job. So we're gonna move on. Let me see. I think we're entitled to a short break now. Let me just double check here. Yep, so we have a 10-minute break. We should be back to, we're a little behind, about 10 minutes behind. So let's be back 3 o'clock, 3 Eastern. So in 10 minutes, we can resume our discussion here. I'll talk to you then.